Today we're going to look at Chapter 10 and the sectional conflicts that started before the Civil War and that led us into Civil War. This slide is a bit of a review from Chapter 9. The Mexican War was an armed conflict between the United States and Mexico from 1846 to 1848 in the wake of the 1845 U.S. annexation of Texas, which Mexico considered part of its territory despite the 1836 Texas Revolution. Combat operations lasted a year and a half from the spring of 1846 to the fall of 1847. American forces occupied New Mexico and California, then invaded parts of northeastern Mexico and northwest Mexico. Meanwhile, the Pacific Squadron conducted a blockade and took control of several garrisons on the Pacific coast further south in Baja California. Another American army captured Mexico City, and the war ended in victory for the U.S. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo specified the major consequences of the war: the forced Mexican secession of the territories of Alta California and New Mexico to the U.S. in exchange for $15 million. In addition, the United States assumed $3.25 million of debt owed by the Mexican government to the U.S. citizens. Mexico accepted the loss of Texas and thereafter cited the Rio Grande as its national border. American territorial expansion to the Pacific coast had been the goal of President James Polk, the leader of the Democratic Party. However, the war was highly controversial in the U.S., with the Whig Party, anti-imperialists, and anti-slavery elements strongly opposed. Heavy American casualties and high monetary costs were also criticized. The political aftermath of the war raised the slavery issue in the United States, leading to the intense debates that pointed to civil war. The Compromise of 1850 provided a brief respite. The impact of the war with Mexico, while many people in the United States, specifically the North, worried about the issue of slavery spreading to the West. During westward expansion, many Northerners helped African American slaves escape to the North during this time. While Northerners had their own worries, Southerners demanded new laws to help them retrieve the African Americans who escaped free territory. President Polk sees trouble ahead. Polk realized that issues facing the United States about slavery were very important. He himself was a Southerner from North Carolina and a slave owner. Polk believed that people would not take slaves to the Southwest because the dry climate would not support the types of farming that made slavery profitable. In Congress, an angry debate broke out, and Polk soon realized that the issue of slavery in the new territories was not something he could brush aside. And what I'd like you to do with this particular map is just see how the expansion of people moving and going from territory to state also expanded through the years the slave trade, or the business of slavery. You can see how it grew from 1789 to 1837 to 1846, and finally this slide is showing you 1858 and how we occupy the same land that we occupy to this day, even though it's not divided up into the same states. But you can see how slavery was in the South. You can even see under 1858 that Nevada is considered a slave territory at this particular time. The Wilmot Proviso. David Wilmot, a Democrat from Pennsylvania, drafted a provision that would not allow slavery in newly acquired Western lands after the war with Mexico. Southerners tried to block it in the House and the Senate, but it passed. The Proviso further separated North and South in their beliefs. Popular sovereignty was a resolution by Lewis Cass to allow each territory to decide if a new state wanted to have slavery. Please remember that, because popular sovereignty is something that is referred to quite often in this chapter. Free Soil Party emerges. The Free Soil Party opposed slavery in the free soil of the Western territories. Most of the members involved with this party wanted to preserve the Western territories for white farmers. They felt that allowing slavery to expand would make it difficult for free men to find work. The party slogan summed up the vows: free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. It was created by Northern Whigs that disagreed with their party and separated, joining the anti-slavery Democrats from New York. Meanwhile, the election of 1848, you can see the different people to the right in their political posters of the time, and you can see who they are and the winners of the parties in the graph below. The election featured candidates from 3 different parties. The Democrats were represented by Lewis Cass from Michigan, who brought up popular sovereignty. Former President Martin Van Buren represented the Free Soil Party, and Zachary Taylor represented the Whig Party. When the votes were counted, Taylor had won the election. And so on this particular slide, we can see the search for compromise in 1850. Please look at the picture to the right, and you can see the president that was elected to the left. In search of compromise, in California, there was the discovery of gold in 1848. By 1849, 80,000 49ers moved to strike it rich, my NFL team. This population boom caused a need for government. This meant that California wanted to become a state. So a great debate begins. Is California going to be slave, or is it going to be free? During the time California was set to enter the Union, a great debate was set off. Many Southerners feared that if California entered the Union as a free state, that slave state would lose power in national politics and become a minority in the Senate. Henry Clay of Kentucky proposed 3 resolutions that offered concessions on both sides. Despite the proposals, it was Senator John C. Calhoun that darkly predicted the secession of the South. The compromise itself of 1850, it was originally, Congress did not pass Clay's bill due to the fact that President Taylor opposed it. Taylor's successor, Vice President Millard Fillmore, believe it or not, that is his name, supported the compromise after Clay stepped down and handed the reins to a younger Stephen Douglas. The bill passed, and President Fillmore signed it into law. The compromise of 1850 was only effective for a short time, however. The hope of a permanent solution through compromise would again quickly fade fast. And again, why was Millard Fillmore there? Because after only 16 months in office, Zachary Taylor died. They think it was of an intestinal issue from something he ate on a 4th of July celebration. So now we can see somebody else, a nice woman who lived in Maine, who set off a very controversial situation during this time. So here's this sweet little woman, Harriet Beecher Stowe, to the right. And what did she do? She wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was the best-selling book of its time. Harriet Beecher Stowe was an abolitionist, originally from Ohio, who wrote a story of a man's life as a slave. It informed Northerners about what was happening in the South, and it made Southerners mad. The following is an excerpt that tells about how Tom is ordered by his owner, Simon Legree, to whip another slave named Lucy. Lucy has not been able to pick enough cotton, so Tom has been putting some of his cotton into Lucy's basket. 2 other slaves inform Legree about this, and Legree orders Tom to whip Lucy. Tom refuses and is punished for his refusal. Now, I can read this to you, but it is in quite the dialect of the time, and I know that I will just be stumbling over the words, so please go ahead and look at those as I read the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act, the Act's inflammatory effects. Under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, a person claiming that an African American had escaped from slavery had only to point out that person as a runaway slave and take him or her into custody. African Americans accused of being fugitives had no right to trial and were not allowed to testify in court. And remember, there was no actual identification on these individuals. So somebody could simply be picked out of a crowd, maybe never living in the South, be pointed at as a fugitive slave, and then that person could be taken back into slavery in the South. Obviously, extremely unfair. Northern resistance grows. Because of the Fugitive Slave Act, many Northerners that were already outraged started to become defiant as the thought of capturing runaway slaves from Southerners. Northern resistance became frequent, public, and sometimes even violent. So because of that, you can see the growth of the Underground Railroad. Here is the map. Please look at the black text boxes, as you can see there, and read through those and look at the map and see exactly where the railroads go as I read the paragraph below on the Underground Railroad. It was an informal yet well-organized system that was legendary during the 1830s. It helped thousands of enslaved persons escape. Members of the Underground Railroad were called conductors. These people transported runaways north to in secret, gave them shelter and food along the way, and saw them to freedom in the northern states or Canada with some money and a fresh start. Harriet Tubman was known as Moses for leading so many out of slavery during this time. And you can see over here, I said that when I was a kid, I really did think that the Underground Railroad was like a system of, like a subway system under the ground. But I'm an adult now, and I know that that's not true. So I hope we can dispel those rumors in your mind at this age for you. Mounting violence. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 may have been the single most significant event leading to the Civil War. By the early 1850s, settlers and entrepreneurs wanted to move into the area now known as Nebraska. And please look at the map to the right as I read this. However, until the area was organized as a territory, settlers would not move there because they could not legally hold a claim to the land. The southern states' representatives in Congress were in no hurry to permit a Nebraska territory because the land lay north of the Missouri Compromise parallel, where slavery had been outlawed by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Just when things between the North and South were in an uneasy balance, Kansas and Nebraska opened fresh wounds. The person behind the Kansas-Nebraska Act was Senator Stephen Douglas, and you'll hear that name so many times because he's going to run against Abraham Lincoln for president. He is of Illinois. He said he wanted to see Nebraska made into a territory and, to win Southern support, proposed the southern state inclined to support slavery. It was Kansas. Underlying it all was his desire to build a transcontinental railroad. So why did he want to do this? Because he wanted to build a transcontinental railroad to go through Chicago. The Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed each territory to decide the issue of slavery based on popular sovereignty. Remember, I told you before we were going to refer to that again. That is each state's right to decide whether or not they wanted slavery in their area. So Bleeding Kansas happened. It was the name given to the state of Kansas due to the territorial civil war between pro- and anti-slavery settlers in the state. By the end of 1856, 200 people had died in the fighting, and $2 million worth of property had been destroyed. Imagine what $2 million in property would be worth today. So the caning of Charles Sumner, could you imagine this acting out in our government? Maybe we could. Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, senator and an abolitionist, was beaten by Preston Brooks, a relative of Senator Andrew Butler, a man that Sumner had insulted in an anti-slavery rant. Brooks beat Sumner with a cane and left him lying bloody on the floor of his office, some say a little brain injured. Many Southerners considered Brooks a hero, and some even sent him canes. Shocked by the attack and outraged for Southern support of Brooks, Northerners strengthened their determination to get rid of slavery. And so if you can look at this particular slide, you can see as we're going into the Crisis Deepens section, we are going to add a new party, and it's called the Republican Party, still around today. So the Republicans organized, they created by the people that were discontented from other parties, mostly over slavery. The Republicans were born out of anger over allowing the Kansas-Nebraska Act to pass. They were against slavery in the territories, similar to Jefferson's original ideas during the Revolutionary times of not wanting the United States to become a monarchy. Republicans united because they feared that the Southern planters were becoming an aristocracy that controlled the federal government. And then we have those know-nothings that we talked about in the last time I made a recording. This party was the anti-Catholic and nativist party. Amazing, because I'm sure they didn't mean nativist by Native American at the time. The party opposed immigration, particularly Catholic immigration, into the United States. Eventually, the Know-Nothing Party would be absorbed by the Republican Party. And of course, many changes then happened. So you can see exactly what was happening during the 1850s, which brings us to another election. And look at these individuals below, another three-party election. So this is the election of 1856. Once again, there were three parties that had all representatives in the election. The Republicans nominated John C. Fremont. I have to admit that is a younger picture of him, and Fremont Street is named after him, as you can see in his speech bubble. The Democrats nominated James Buchanan, a man that served as an ambassador to Russia and Great Britain, as well as serving in the Congress for 20 years. Sounds like he's pretty well developed for the job, and the American Party, which we never hear about anymore, hoping to attract the vote of former Whigs, nominated former President Millard Fillmore. Remember, he filled the space left by Zachary Taylor when Zachary Taylor died, possibly, by an intestinal infection from eating cherries. When the votes were counted, James Buchanan had won. The election was primarily about slavery. So you can see who these individuals are in this particular slide. So this is a nice big slide about Dred Scott and the Dred Scott decision, which is one of the darkest hours of our history. Again, I suppose there's several, but here's another one. The Dred Scott decision in March of 1857, the United States Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Roger Taney, declared that all blacks, slaves as well as free, were not and could not become citizens of the United States. The court also declared in 1820 Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, thus permitting slavery in all of the country's territories. Okay, so you can see that sometimes the Supreme Court of our United States gets it extremely wrong, and this is just one of those circumstances. The case before the court was that of Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott, a slave who had lived in a free state of Illinois and a free territory of Wisconsin before moving back to a slave state of Missouri, had appealed to the Supreme Court in hopes of being granted his freedom. Taney, a staunch supporter of slavery and intent on protecting Southerners from Northern aggression, wrote in the court's majority opinion that because Scott was black, he was not a citizen and therefore had no right to sue. The framers of the Constitution, he wrote, believed that blacks had no rights, which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. He was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and traffic whenever profit could be made by it. It is just obviously disgusting that we can go back into our history and see that a Supreme Court justice, who, by the way, is allowed to stay in that position for their entire lives because there is not a 4-year, 6-year, or 2-year limit on their election because they're not elected, they are appointed, made that decision. So let's go down to Kansas's Lecompton Constitution. In Kansas, pro-slavery forces approved it. President Buchanan, then president for Congress, to admit Kansas as a slave state. Remember, Buchanan is a Democrat. The Senate quickly voted to accept Lecompton Constitution, but the House of Representatives blocked it. If the settlers in Kansas were to object this constitution, they would delay statehood for Kansas for at least 2 more years. Eventually, the settlers of Kansas voted overwhelmingly in 1858 to reject the Lecompton Constitution. They did not want slavery in their state. As a result, Kansas did not gain statehood until 1861, which of course is the year that the Civil War begins. Lincoln and Douglas, very famous, and now if you are in debate, there are the Lincoln-Douglas debates, the LD debates, because it's famous about their debates. In 1858, Illinois Republicans chose a relatively unknown name, Abraham Lincoln. In order for Lincoln to gain some exposure, he decided to propose a series of debates with Douglas, Stephen Douglas. Douglas confidently accepted. Throughout the process, Lincoln earned a reputation for himself as a man of clear, insightful thinking. He was eventually defeated by Douglas, and this is for the Senate, but had established himself in the process. At the time, the pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces were a major conflict with one another, while anti-slavery forces voted down the Constitution. So here's a nice little interesting fact with John Brown. You see 2 pictures of him to the right. You see a very pro-John Brown picture of him with his arms spread, and then you see a lithograph of his actual hanging and execution. So John Brown had a raid. He really was very fervent about his ideas. Unfortunately, he was going to use murder to get to them, but he was very fervent about being an abolitionist. He hated slavery. John Brown led a small army of 18 men. I think that that's just a family, right? 18, that's barely an army, to the small town of Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His plan was to instigate a major slave rebellion in the South. He would seize the arms and ammunition in a federal arsenal, arm the slaves in the area, and move south along the Appalachian Mountains, attracting slaves to his cause. Now, Maybe if he had social media and he could have tweeted it out, gone onto Facebook like they do in Egypt, maybe there would have been an actual rebellion that would have had some substance. But unfortunately, he did not have that back then. And so he had no rations. He had no escape route. His plan was doomed from the very beginning, and it did not succeed to deepen the divide between the North and South. Soon after Brown's raid had started, he was tried and convicted, then sentenced to death. Many Northerners viewed Brown as a martyr in a noble cause. He strengthened abolitionist feelings in the North. The Southerners realized that his raid proved the Northerners were actively plotting to murder the slaveholders. So we get to the point in Section 4 where the Union finally dissolves, which means falls apart. And then secession is that word at the bottom, which is the act of withdrawing from an organization, union, or especially a political entity. So secession means we leave you. And why? Well, let's go to that election of 1860. The Democrats split, all right? And so that splits their votes between other candidates. In 1860, the debate over slavery in Western Territory finally tore the Democratic Party apart. It split the Democratic Party, greatly improved Republican prospects, which was what some of the more radical Southerner delegates had intended all along. They hoped a Republican victory would be the final straw that would convince the Southern states to secede. So Lincoln is elected. You can see he is the winner in 1860. So it's November, but he's not going to be placed into office until March. Okay, so think of that timeline. So with no possibility of winning electoral votes in the South, the Republicans turned to Abraham Lincoln, hoping he could sweep the North. Lincoln's debates with Douglas had made him very popular in the North, with the Democratic votes split between Douglas, who was advocating for popular sovereignty, and Breckinridge. Lincoln won the election without Southern support. This victory for the Republicans was viewed as a victory for abolitionists. For many in the South, only choice was to secede. South Carolina, a state where secessionist ideas had long been proposed, unanimously voted for the Ordinance of Secession. By February 1st, now remember, he's not quite president yet, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas have voted to secede. Many Southerners thought that by seceding, they were actually fighting for American rights. I guess history has judged them to be absolutely wrong. So what I want you to look at here is the division of slavery states in the election of 1860. So you can see where the slave states are, where the Republicans are on the right, and you can see exactly how this comes into play, how the issue of slavery obviously divided. And the Southern Democrats were basically that group of people that did secede, that were pro-slavery. And the Northern Republicans were basically the pro-abolitionists. So slavery division of the states are divided between slave and free, but there are more free states with some slave territories on the horizon becoming states. The Civil War began on April 12, 1861, with the Confederates firing on Fort Sumter. This is what the U.S. looked like at the beginning of the war. Remember, Nevada's motto is battle-born because we became a state during the Civil War. So why they needed our silver. So even though you can see that we were slated to become probably a slave state, we ended up not becoming a slave state. Some writers blame the Democrats, and especially the Southern Democrats, for Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860. The split of the Democratic Party that summer is said to have helped open the door for the new Republican Party because the divided Democrats could not agree on a candidate. This theory, as this theory goes, the split of the party allowed Lincoln to capture the White House with a mere 39% of the popular vote. But, history has judged this to actually be false. Some things take hindsight to clean up, and that might be one of them. So as you look, we are just looking at a few slides here at the beginning of, as we go to the beginning of the Civil War, which will be our next chapter. So you can see who ends up being the president of the Confederate States, the president of the United States, and you can see how the states themselves are divided along the area of what's a union, what's a southern state, and who are the border states. Compromise fails in Crittenden's Compromise, where Congress tried to reinstate the Missouri Compromise. It was failed, and it was the final straw to leaving the Union. The last attempt at peace, Virginia, which was a slave state, proposed a peace conference. The conference was held in D.C., with delegates from 21 states present. None of the delegates in attendance were from the secessionist states. So what's going to get done, really? Very little progress was made during the final attempt, and ultimately the modified version of that did not work. Founding of the Confederacy, while the delegates from the North met, so did the delegates from the seceding states. The Southern delegates met in Montgomery, Alabama. That's pretty far away from Washington, D.C. They called themselves the Confederate States of America, or simply the Confederacy. The convention also named Jefferson Davis as the first president of the Confederacy. So, well, when you secede, and when you formally secede, and when you elect your own president and rename your country, I guess there's going to be a civil war. So Lincoln takes office in March. Within 1 month, there would be the start of the Civil War. Imagine a president entering on such shaky grounds. He said he was committed to not interfering with slavery where it existed already. And he also did not threaten to secede the seceded states. But he did say that he would hold, occupy, and possess federal property in those states. So that's all of the forts, where all the ammunition is, all those types of things. So this is the last text, slide with text, and what I want you to associate is the stars and bars, the gray, the South, and Jefferson Davis, as being against the stars and stripes, the blue, the North, and Abraham Lincoln. You need to kind of remember those things. Those are basic concepts of the Civil War. And you can see the start of the Civil War is right here at Fort Sumter. Notice it's just surrounded by water. The morning of April 12th, 1861, Jefferson Davis decided to take Fort Sumter because he had kind of taken all the other forts that were on land, but they kind of had to do a little more work to get this one. Because the U.S. Supply ship arrived, in doing this, Davis did not have to fire on the U.S. supply ship, would have led to war with the U.S. The Confederate Army bombarded the fort for 33 straight hours, but did not kill anyone. Anderson and his men were exhausted and eventually surrendered. The Upper South secedes. After Fort Sumter was captured, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to serve the military for 90 days. This caused a panic in the Upper South. Although many of the states in the Upper South did not want to secede, they eventually felt they had no choice. Virginia led the way, seceding on April 17, 1861. They were followed by Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Hanging on to the border states, 3 main border states that were the cause for concern were Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. Each state had several reasons to take either side, and Lincoln knew it. It was essential to keep these states with the Union. Delaware was also a border state. The Confederacy did not help their chances when they occupied the southwest corner of Kentucky. This led to the Kentuckians declaring war on the Confederacy, but it left the state torn due to the fact that some Kentuckians actually wanted to secede. So what we have come to is the end of this chapter, and you can see this beautiful picture of the firing on Fort Sumter, and I hope that this prepares you for our beginning to our Civil War.